Chapter 1. A deal sealed under the moon. The air in the Moon Shadow Pack's council hall was thick, heavy with the scent of aged oak and the faint tang of burning sage. The ancient table creaked under the weight of centuries-old treaty scrolls, their yellowed edges curling as though they, too, wanted to escape the room. I sat at the head of the table, back straight, hands clasped tight enough to crack knuckles. My gaze bore into the intricate wolf sigil embossed on the nearest scroll, but I barely saw it. My mind raced, clawing for a way out of this tangled mess. Across from me, Celine Voss leaned forward, her sharp silver eyes unyielding as moonlight reflected off a blade. Her fingers drummed a steady, mocking rhythm on the table. The woman was all sharp angles and controlled ferocity, a walking embodiment of "don't mess with me." "So," Celine began, her voice as cool and cutting as a mountain wind, "the mighty Alaric Kane finally graces us with his presence. Tell me, do you always sulk like this, or is it a special occasion?" I dragged my gaze up to meet hers, schooling my features into the carefully neutral mask I wore so well. "Some of us take treaties seriously, Celine. This isn't a casual dinner invitation." Her smirk widened, a flash of teeth that was more predator than pleasant. "And some of us recognize when treaties are little more than leashes. Tell me, Alaric, do you enjoy being collared by tradition, or is that just the Kane family way?" I clenched my jaw, but before I could retort she leaned back in her chair, folding her arms with calculated ease. "Relax, Alpha. I don't bite much, but let's not pretend either of us wants this alliance." "You're not pretending, that's for sure," I said dryly. Her eyes narrowed ever so slightly. "I don't need a reluctant prince. I need a partner who can keep up." I leaned forward, bracing my elbows on the table as the tension coiled between us. "You'll get an alpha who keeps his word. That should be enough." Her laugh was low and humorless, a sound that managed to echo despite the confined space. "Enough for whom? Your peck or your ego?" There it was. The jab meant to draw blood. I let it bounce off, though the effort made my teeth grind. "For both our packs," I said evenly. "Don't forget, Celine, we're playing the same game. You just prefer sharper claws." Her smile didn't falter, but her hands tightened imperceptibly against the table's edge. "Fine, Alpha Kane. If we're playing games, let's play fair." "Fair?" The word tasted foreign, bitter. Nothing about this alliance was fair, but fairness had never been my luxury. I reached for the scroll, my fingers brushing the faded ink. The treaty was older than either of us, binding in ways that defied reason. Celine watched me, her gaze piercing, searching for a crack. "Just remember, Alaric, the Moon Shadow Pack isn't the only one making sacrifices here." I stared back, refusing to flinch under her scrutiny. "Trust me, Celine, no one's forgetting." Her smirk softened into something unreadable, and for a moment I caught a glimpse of something behind her armor. Doubt, regret. It vanished too quickly to name. She stood abruptly, the scrape of her chair echoing like a challenge. "Then I suppose we're done here," she said, voice cool again. "For now," I replied, my tone matching hers. She turned, her sleek frame cutting through the room with a grace I could never hope to mimic. As the heavy doors creaked shut behind her, I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. For now. This alliance might hold, but it would be a fragile thing, ready to snap at the first sign of weakness. And Celine Voss wasn't the type to let an advantage go unnoticed. The moment Celine swept out of the council hall, I slumped back in my chair, the rigid formality draining from my posture like water spilling from a cracked jug. The weight of the treaty scrolls still pressed against the table and against my skull, but at least I didn't have to stare into Celine's storm-cloud eyes any more. Not that my relief lasted long. Pups with her diplomacy and your temper. Now, that sounds like a nightmare waiting to happen. I groaned, pinching the bridge of my nose. "Gavin, don't you have a hobby? Something that doesn't involve driving me insane?" My younger brother sauntered into the room, hands tucked casually into his jacket pockets. his grin as infuriatingly easygoing as ever. His shaggy blonde hair was perpetually tousled, like he'd just rolled out of bed, or a fight, and the mischievous gleam in his hazel eyes told me he'd been eavesdropping again. "Who needs hobbies when you provide so much entertainment?" he said, plopping into the chair Celine had vacated, propping his boots on the table like he owned the place. "Seriously, though, you and Celine in the same room? Sparks flying everywhere? I thought the table might catch fire." "It's called diplomacy," I muttered. Gavin snorted. "Diplomacy? That's what you call her glaring daggers while you grumble like a kicked puppy. Yeah, sure, let's go with that." I shot him a withering look, but he was immune to my glowering, always had been. "This is serious, Gavin. The alliance..." "He's about as stable as a stack of twigs in a windstorm," he interrupted. "Which, by the way, is why I'm suggesting the pup angle. Nothing unites rival packs like adorable little heirs. You can thank me later when the peace treaty lasts longer than a week." My jaw tightened and I fought the urge to chuck one of the heavy scrolls at his head. "You're hilarious, really. When you're done auditioning for Court Jester, maybe you can contribute something useful." Gavin leaned back, folding his arms behind his head. "Oh, I am contributing. You need to lighten up, big brother. This whole brooding and shtick, it's getting old." I glanced at the door, half expecting Celine to storm back in and hear this nonsense. If Celine heard you... "She'd probably agree with me," Gavin said, his grin widening. "Not about the pups, maybe, but definitely about the brooding." "You're impossible," I muttered. "And you're stuck with me." I shook my head, a reluctant smile tugging at the corners of my mouth despite myself. Gavin always knew how to push my buttons, but he also had a knack for diffusing the tension before it swallowed me whole. He didn't realize it, probably wouldn't care if he did, but I was grateful. "Fine," I said, standing and rolling up the nearest scroll. "If you're done with your commentary, maybe you can make yourself useful and..." "Hold on, let me guess," he said, cutting me off. "Go check the perimeter? Spy on Celine? Or is this one of those fetch me coffee moments?" "Just get out of my sight before I decide to banish you," I shot back, my tone half serious. Gavin laughed, pushing off the table and heading for the door with a casual salute. "You got it, Alpha." The room felt quieter, too quiet, once he left. I glanced at the scrolls one last time before letting out a heavy sigh. The treaty, the alliance, Selim, all of it loomed over me like a storm waiting to break. And somehow Gavin's quip about pups still lingered in the back of my mind. What a nightmare indeed. I took a long, steadying breath and reached for the carved wooden box at the center of the table. The weight of it was far greater than the polished cedar should have allowed, as if the centuries of tradition it carried had sunk into the grain. The door creaked open again, and Celine re-entered the room with a kind of regal composure that made it impossible to believe she'd ever cracked a joke in her life. Her silver eyes flicked to the box in my hands, then back to my face. "So," she said, her tone even but cool, "are we doing this, or are you going to brood over the carvings for another hour?" "Just savouring the moment," I replied dryly. "You know how I love ancient customs." Celine's lips curved into the faintest ghost of a smirk, sharp, fleeting, and gone before I could be sure it was ever there. She stepped closer, her movements deliberate, as if she were stalking prey. I opened the box and retrieved the token inside. A medallion, its surface etched with the entwined sigils of the moon shadow and Nightfang packs. A full moon framed the design, gleaming faintly in the dim light of the hall. She extended her hand, palm up, and I hesitated a fraction longer than I should have. Her gaze didn't waver, her expression betraying nothing. Finally I placed the medallion in her hand, our fingers brushing for the briefest moment. Her skin was cold, expected somehow, but steady, unyielding. In return she produced a similar token from a pouch at her side. The Nightfang Pack's emblem was centered, surrounded by crescent moons and stars. When she handed it to me, I felt the faint prickle of power in the metal, as if it recognized my touch. The weight of the exchange settled in the room. heavier than the silence that followed. I met Selene's gaze again, the unspoken challenge between us as loud as a wolf's howl. "It's done, then," she said, her voice carrying a finality that made my chest tighten. "For better or worse," I replied, my tone clipped. Selene turned the medallion over in her palm, her expression inscrutable. "Let's hope it's the former," she said softly, then slipped the token into the pouch and walked toward the door. This time, I didn't stop her. I simply stood there, staring down at the medallion in my hand, as if it held answers to questions I wasn't ready to ask. The uneasy truce was solidified, the alliance bound by ancient tradition and brittle promises. But as I watched Selene's silhouette vanish through the door, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of a much bigger storm. The token's cool weight pressed into my palm, a reminder that peace, like alliances, often came with a price. And something told me we hadn't paid the full cost yet. The dog squirmed on the metal exam table, his scruffy fur matted with dirt and his brown eyes wide with terror. His left ear flopped at an odd angle, giving him a lopsided look that tugged at my heart. "Hold still, buddy," I murmured, tucking my auburn hair behind my ear with one hand while I worked the needle with the other. "You've been through worse than a few stitches, I promise." "Talking to the patients again?" Sammy quipped from behind me, her voice lilting with amusement. "Should I start worrying about your social life?" I didn't have to look up to know she was grinning. "Why worry when you're here to keep me company?" I shot back, glancing over my shoulder at her. Sammy stood by the counter, a roll of gauze in one hand and her phone in the other. Her blonde ponytail bobbed as she chuckled. "True," she said, snapping a picture of the dog. "This guy's definitely going on our before and after wall. What are we calling him? Scrappy? Sir Wiggles?" I focused on tying off the final stitch before answering. "How about Houdini? He managed to get out of 2 traps and dodge animal control before winding up here." Sammy wrinkled her nose. "Houdini? Too obvious. What about Sir Flopsalot? Look at that ear." The dog whined softly, his tail giving a hesitant wag as if he understood he was the butt of the joke. "Sir Flopsalot it is," I said with a laugh, running my fingers gently over his fur to check for other injuries. "What do you think, buddy? Fancy enough for you?" "He's a stray, Ella," Sammy pointed out, rolling her eyes. "He probably thinks, hey, you is fancy." "Every dog deserves a title," I replied, scratching behind Sir Flopsalot's good ear. He leaned into my touch, a soft whimper escaping his throat. Sammy set down the gauze and grabbed the treats from the cabinet. "You spoil them," she said, tossing me a piece of jerky. "Guilty," I said, holding the treat just out of reach until the dog gave me his best puppy dog eyes. "But you're just mad you didn't think of it first." Sammy smirked, leaning against the counter. "I'll admit you've got away with them. It's borderline magical." I rolled my eyes but couldn't help the small smile that tugged at my lip. "It's called patience, Sammy. You should try it sometime." "Patience isn't my style," she said breezily. "Charm, maybe, wit, definitely, but patience, hard pass." I finished cleaning up Sir Flopsalot and handed him a second treat. He wagged his tail more confidently this time, his big soulful eyes watching my every move. "There," I said, stepping back and wiping my hands on my scrubs. "He's all patched up. Now let's see if we can find him a home before he decides to make a break for it." "Yeah, good luck with that," Sammy said, already scrolling through her phone. "If no one claims him, you know he's staying with you, right?" I shook my head, but I couldn't stop the grin from spreading across my face. "Don't start, Sammy." "Too late. You're a sucker, Ella Harper, and everyone knows it, including Sir Flopsalot here." The dog barked, a high-pitched yip that sounded suspiciously like agreement. I sighed, rubbing the back of my neck as I glanced around the small, cluttered clinic. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine, and moments like these, snappy banter, wagging tails, and the warmth of making a difference, were the reason I wouldn't trade it for the world, even if Sammy was right about me being a sucker. The clinic door banged open so hard I nearly dropped the gauze I was holding. Sammy let out a startled squeak, and I whirled around to see Old Man Carlyle barreling in, red-faced and wild-eyed, his straw hat askew. "Ella, you've got to come quick." he shouted, clutching his chest dramatically like he was auditioning for the town theatre. "His Duchess, she's down in the field, and I think she's— oh, Lord, I think she's dying." I was already pulling off my gloves. "What happened?" I asked, grabbing my kit from the counter. "She just collapsed," he said, pacing like a panicked rooster in a henhouse. "One minute she was fine, the next she's sprawled out, wheezing like a busted bellows." "Okay, calm down," I said, slinging the kit over my shoulder. "We'll sort it out. Sammy, keep an eye on Flopsalot while I'm gone." "You mean Sir Flopsalot," Sammy corrected, grinning despite the chaos. "Good luck saving the Duchess." I rolled my eyes but couldn't help smiling. Thanks for the vote of confidence. Carlyle led me to the truck, and we bounced down the dirt road to his farm, his constant stream of muttered prayers doing little to steady my nerves. When we reached the field, I spotted Duchess, a magnificent dappled mare, lying on her side, her chest heaving. "Duchess!" I murmured, crouching beside her. She blinked at me, her dark eyes glossy with pain. "Hey, girl, let's see what's going on." Carlyle hovered anxiously. "She's my best horse, Ellis. She's family." "I know," I said gently, pressing my stethoscope to her flank. Her heartbeat was erratic but steady enough to keep me hopeful. "Let me work, okay?" As I examined her, the puzzle pieces started to click together. Her laboured breathing, the bloated abdomen, it all screamed colic. "I think she's colicking," I told Carlyle. "She probably got into something she shouldn't have eaten. We'll need to relieve the pressure." "Can you fix her?" he asked, his voice shaking. "She's got a good shot," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. With Carlyle's help, I got Duchess upright, her legs trembling beneath her, and started the necessary treatment. It was messy work, involving a stomach tube, mineral oil, and a lot of patience. All the while, Carlyle fretted like a nervous father-to-be. "She's strong," I reassured him. "She's going to pull through." Just as Duchess began to show signs of improvement, a low, mournful howl cut through the still evening air. I froze, the sound sending an unexpected shiver down my spine. "That doesn't sound like one of your dogs," I said, glancing toward the tree line. Carlyle shook his head. "Wolves," he muttered. "They've been getting bolder lately. Too bold, if you ask me. Wolves were just animals, same as any other." And yet something about that howl lingered in my chest, heavy and strange. "Well," I said, forcing a smile as I patted Duchess's neck. "Good thing Duchess has me to keep the big bad wolves at bay, huh?" Carlyle chuckled, but I couldn't help glancing at the darkening forest again, my stomach knotting for reasons I couldn't quite explain. By the time I got back to the clinic, the sun had dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of burnt orange and deep indigo. Sammy had left for the night, leaving me alone with Sir Flopsalot, who was now snoozing in a makeshift bed of blankets in the corner. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that settles over small towns after dark, calm and peaceful, but with just enough edge to keep you listening. I was just locking up the front door when I heard it. Scratch! The sound was faint but persistent, coming from the back door, probably a raccoon or a stray cat. Still, it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. "Great," I muttered to myself, because tonight hasn't been exciting enough. Grabbing a flashlight, I tiptoed through the clinic, feeling a bit ridiculous for creeping around my own workspace. Sir Flopsalot perked his head up, his floppy ear twitching as he stared toward the sound. "Stay there," I told him, which was pointless, since he didn't seem inclined to move anyway. The scratching came again, more insistent this time. My heart thumped a little faster as I unlocked the back door and swung it open. The flashlight beam swept over the empty alley behind the clinic. For a second, I thought I'd imagined the whole thing. Then the beam landed on a dark shape slumped just outside the doorway. It was a wolf. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It was huge, bigger than any wolf I'd ever seen in real life, with a thick coat of dark fur matted with blood. One of its forelegs was twisted at an unnatural angle, and its chest rose and fell in shallow, laboured breaths. "Well," I whispered, more to myself than to the wolf, "You're definitely not a raccoon." The wolf's ears twitched, and for a moment I swore its amber eyes flicked open to meet mine. They were piercing, intelligent, too intelligent. I hesitated, my instincts warring with my training. On one hand, this was a wild animal, and getting involved was probably a terrible idea. On the other hand, it was injured, and leaving it to die felt wrong. "Okay, big guy," I said softly, crouching down and keeping my movements slow. "I don't know how you got here, but you've got the right address. Let's see if I can help." The wolf didn't move as I dragged a blanket from the supply shelf and carefully draped it over him. His body was hot to the touch, his fur sticky with blood. "This is definitely above my pay grade," I muttered, grabbing my kit. "Sammy's going to kill me when she finds out." As I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something off about him. He didn't flinch or growl, even when I cleaned his wounds. Instead, he watched me with those sharp amber eyes, as if he understood exactly what I was doing. "There," I said, after what felt like an eternity, sitting back on my heels. "That should hold you together for now." The wolf let out a low, rumbling sound that might have been a growl or a laugh. "You're welcome," I said, rolling my eyes. "Next time, try not to pick a fight you can't win, okay?" The wolf's eyes closed, and I thought he might be drifting off, when he suddenly struggled to his feet, wobbling unsteadily. "Ooh, easy." I reached out, but he shook his head, and took a shaky step toward the door. "You've got to be kidding me," I said, blocking his path. "You can barely stand. Where are you planning to go, huh? Back into the woods so you can bleed out in peace?" The wolf huffed, and if wolves could roll their eyes, I was pretty sure he just did. Before I could stop him, he nudged past me, limping into the alley. "Unbelievable," I muttered, watching as he disappeared into the shadows. For a moment I stood there, staring after him, the strange encounter playing on a loop in my head. Then, somewhere in the distance, another wolf howled, a long, mournful sound that sent a shiver down my spine. "Definitely above my pay grade," I whispered, closing the door and locking it tight. I stayed crouched in the doorway, flashlight trembling just enough to make me feel ridiculous. The wolf's growl rumbled low and steady, a warning wrapped in pain, and I swallowed hard. His amber eyes locked on me, sharp and burning, daring me to try something stupid. "Look, I get it," I said, keeping my voice soft. "You're having a bad day. Probably a bad week, maybe even a bad life. But here's the thing. I'm not the enemy." The growl softened, more of a warning purr now, and I took that as encouragement. Slowly I set the flashlight on the ground and grabbed the blanket I'd draped over his back. "Don't bite me, okay?" I murmured, my hands steady but my heart hammering. I mean, I'd probably taste terrible, and trust me, I'm not in the mood to explain a wolf bite to Dr. Langston. He didn't snap, though his ears flicked back and his breathing hitched when I touched the torn fur around his shoulder. The gash was deep, oozing blood that matted his coat and stuck to my gloves. I winced. "Yikes! You really went all in, huh? Who did this to you? Another wolf? A bear? The forest mafia?" His eyes narrowed, and for a split second I could have sworn he was insulted. "Okay, no jokes," I said quickly. "Noted." I cleaned the wound as gently as I could, muttering soothing nonsense under my breath. "You're tougher than you look, you know. A lot of wolves wouldn't even make it this far. But you're out here, growling at me, still standing. Well, sort of." That's impressive." The wolf let out a huff, somewhere between a sigh and a scoff. "Hey, I'm serious," I said, dabbing the torn flesh with antiseptic. "You've got grit, big guy. But grit only gets you so far. You've got to let someone help you once in a while. Otherwise you're just a stubborn mess, bleeding all over somebody's doorstep." He went still, his chest rising and falling in shallow pants. For a moment I thought I might have overstepped. Then his amber eyes shifted, meeting mine with a look so piercing, so unnervingly human, that it stole the breath from my lungs. It wasn't just the pain or the fear. It was something deeper, something ancient and unspoken, like he was trying to tell me something important without words. The moment broke when he shifted, wincing as he pulled his leg closer to his body. "Okay, fine," I said, pulling back. "I'll take that as thank you, Ella, for saving my life." "You're welcome, by the way." I reached for a clean bandage, but he surprised me by pushing himself upright. "Oh, hey, easy there." I held up my hands, unsure whether I was trying to calm him or myself. "You're not exactly in marathon shape, buddy." The wolf ignored me. He wobbled on his unsteady legs, his head low, and started limping toward the alley. "You've got to be kidding me," I muttered, scrambling to block his path. "You're seriously just going to walk away, after I just risked my fingers to keep you in one piece?" He paused, looking at me over his shoulder. That same burning gaze locked onto mine again, softer this time, almost grateful. "Fine," I said, throwing my hands up. "Be mysterious and broody, see if I care. Just don't let me find you back here tomorrow in worse shape, or I'm charging you for the supplies." The wolf made a sound that was almost a chuckle, low and rumbling, then turned and limped into the darkness. I stood there in the doorway, my arms crossed, watching until he disappeared into the shadows. "Unbelievable," I muttered, shaking my head. The alley was quiet again, but the weight of his stare lingered in the back of my mind, warm and unsettling all at once. Something told me that wouldn't be the last I'd see of him. And for reasons I couldn't quite explain, the thought wasn't as alarming as it should have been. Chapter 2. A meet-cute with teeth. The early morning sunlight dappled the forest floor, filtering through the canopy in golden streaks that made everything look like it belonged in a fairy tale. Ella Harper adjusted the strap of her camera bag, her boots crunching softly against the undergrowth as she wandered deeper into the woods. She stopped to snap a photo of a curious squirrel perched on a branch, its tail twitching as it stared back at her. "Don't worry, I'm not here to steal your acorns," she said aloud, her voice breaking the silence of the forest. Solitude had its perks, she decided. No deadlines, no panicked farmers, and most importantly, no judgmental side-eyes from Sammy about her tendency to talk to animals like they were old friends. The woods were her escape, a place where she could breathe without the weight of responsibilities pressing down on her chest. Today she needed it more than ever. The events of the previous night still played on a loop in her mind. The injured wolf, its piercing gaze, the way it had limped off into the night like some tragic hero in an old legend. She shook her head, trying to clear the image. "Not my circus, not my wolf," she muttered, lifting her camera to focus on a particularly gnarly tree root that had twisted into a shape resembling a claw. Click. Ella moved further into the forest, her steps slow and deliberate as she scanned the area for her next subject. She hadn't meant to stray this far from the usual trails, but the morning was too beautiful to resist, and her curiosity had a way of leading her off course. Unbeknownst to her, the subtle markers that divided human territory from werewolf lands were well behind her now. The attack came without warning. One moment, Ella was crouched, trying to capture a close-up of a tiny patch of moss glowing emerald in the sunlight. The next, a low growl rumbled from the underbrush, freezing her in place. She turned her head slowly, her heart thudding in her chest as her gaze landed on a pair of yellow eyes gleaming from the shadows. Before she could even process the danger, a rogue wolf exploded from the undergrowth, its teeth bared and its body moving with terrifying speed. Ella stumbled backward, her camera clattering to the ground as she threw her arms up instinctively. "Oh, no, bad wolf, very bad wolf." The wolf lunged, but before he could reach her, a dark blur barreled into it with the force of a freight train. The impact sent both wolves tumbling across the forest floor in a flurry of snapping jaws and tangled limbs. Ella scrambled to her feet, her breath coming in sharp, panicked gasps as she watched the scene unfold. The second wolf was massive, its dark fur glinting in the sunlight as it moved with brutal efficiency. It was clear within moments that this was no ordinary animal. Every movement was calculated, every strike precise. Ella's legs locked beneath her as the larger wolf, her wolf, she realized with a bizarre sense of certainty, pinned the rogue to the ground with a vicious snarl. The rogue struggled for a moment before yelping and darting back into the shadows, its tail tucked firmly between its legs. For a few heartbeats, the dark wolf stood still, its head low and its teeth bared as it stared after the retreating rogue. Then it turned, its amber eyes locking onto Ella. She froze, her pulse racing as the realization sank in. "Oh!" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's you!" The wolf tilted its head slightly, its gaze unreadable, before taking a cautious step toward her. "Okay," Ella said, holding up her hands like she was trying to calm a particularly skittish horse. "Let's not make this weirder than it already is. You just saved my life, and I'm grateful, super grateful, but maybe don't eat me now, okay?" The wolf huffed, a sound that was almost exasperated, and took another step forward. Ella blinked. "What is it with you and dramatic entrances? Are you trying to give me a heart attack, or is this just your thing?" The wolf sat back on its haunches, still watching her with that intense, almost human focus. Ella exhaled shakily, lowering her hands. "You not going to hurt me, are you?" she asked softly. The wolf's ears flicked, and for a moment she could have sworn it was shaking its head. "Right," she said, her voice steadier now. "I guess we're even then. You save me, I patch you up. Let's call it square." The wolf let out a low growl, not threatening, more like agreement, before turning and loping off into the woods. Ella stood there for a long moment, staring after him. Then she glanced down at her camera, still lying in the dirt, and let out a shaky laugh. "Next time," she said to no one in particular, "I'm bringing pepper spray." The woods fell eerily silent after the rogue wolf retreated, the quiet pressing in on Ella like the dense forest canopy above. She took an unsteady step backward, her fingers brushing against the bark of a tree for support. Her eyes were glued to the dark wolf that had saved her, a wolf she now realized wasn't entirely, well, a wolf. Her saviour stood motionless, amber eyes locked on her with an intensity that felt almost tangible. But then something changed. The wolf let out a low, guttural sound, not quite a growl, and its body began to shift. At first Ella thought her eyes were playing tricks on her, but the air around the wolf shimmered like heat waves rising from pavement, and then it happened. Fur melted away to reveal skin. Joints cracked and reformed, limbs stretching and twisting in ways that made Ella's stomach flip. The wolf's snout shortened into a strong jawline, and its ears shifted to a familiar human shape. The entire transformation took mere seconds, but to Ella it felt like a surreal eternity. When it was over, she found herself staring not at a hulking wolf, but at a man, a very naked man. Ella stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a yelp. The man's dark hair was dishevelled, his broad shoulders heaving with the effort of the shift. His amber eyes, still unsettlingly intense, met hers, and for a heartbeat neither of them spoke. "Well," she finally managed, her voice high-pitched and shaky, "this is new." The man raised an eyebrow as if her reaction amused him. You're human," she blurted, then winced. "I mean, obviously, you're not just human, but you can change into a wolf, which is—" She gestured vaguely, her mind scrambling for coherent words. "Totally normal, happens all the time." He took a step toward her, his movements slow and deliberate, like he was trying not to spook her. "Are you done?" he asked, his voice deep and calm. Ella's mouth opened, but no sound came out. She pointed a trembling finger at him instead, then hastily averted her gaze. Clothes? You might want to—" The man looked down at himself and gave a faint, humourless laugh. "Right, forgot about that part." Ella let out a strangled noise that might have been a laugh if she weren't so busy trying to process what she'd just witnessed. "You forgot? Do you do this often?" "Only when necessary," he replied smoothly, crouching to grab a loose branch from the forest floor. He snapped it in half, more for something to do than any practical purpose. "Right. Necessary?" she said, her voice thick with disbelief. "Because battling a rabid wolf, and then— That was totally on my bingo card for today." "You're welcome, by the way," he said, his tone dry as he met her wide-eyed gaze again. Ella blinked. For what? For saving your life. Her cheeks flushed and she crossed her arms. I wasn't in that much danger. He tilted his head, his expression a mix of amusement and exasperation. You were standing in rogue territory with no weapon, no plan, and absolutely no idea what you were dealing with. She opened her mouth to argue, but found she didn't have a leg to stand on. Fine, she said, throwing her hands up. Thanks for the rescue. Now, can someone please explain to me why werewolves are suddenly real and why no one bothered to send me a memo? The man smirked, a faint, lopsided thing that made him look almost boyish despite the situation. It's a long story. Well, Ella said, planting her hands on her hips, lucky for you I've got nothing but time. The man sighed, rubbing the back of his neck as if he already regretted the impending conversation. This is going to be interesting, Ella couldn't help but laugh, loud, bright, and maybe a little hysterical. Oh, buddy, she said, shaking her head, you have no idea. Ella stood rooted to the spot, her hands planted on her hips as she eyed the man. Wolf? Standing before her, he had the audacity to look entirely unbothered, despite the fact that he had just shifted from a snarling wolf into a very naked, very human figure right in front of her. Let me get this straight, she said, breaking the silence. You just swoop in, save the day, scare off a rogue wolf, and then stand there like this is just a Tuesday for you? Alaric arched a dark brow, his amber eyes gleaming with quiet amusement. It's a little more common than you'd think. Ayla snorted, crossing her arms. Well, lucky me. It's not every day my knight in furry armour shows up uninvited. His lips twitched, almost forming a smile. Knight in furry armour, she gestured vaguely toward the spot where the rogue wolf had disappeared. You're out here, saving damsels in distress, growling at bad guys. What else am I supposed to call you? Sir Growls-a-lot? He let out a low chuckle, the sound rich and surprisingly warm. I'd prefer Alaric. Alaric? She repeated, testing the name like it might have thorns. Right. Well, Alaric, I don't know if anyone's told you, but the whole heroic rescue thing is a bit more charming when you're, clothed. He raised both hands in mock surrender. Noted. Ella shook her head, a grin tugging at the corners of her lips despite the absurdity of the situation. And here I thought today was going to be boring. Thanks for proving me wrong. You're welcome, he said smoothly, his expression serious despite the playful glint in his eyes. She tilted her head, studying him like a particularly challenging puzzle. Do you always make such dramatic entrances, or am I just special? Depends, he said, his voice taking on a teasing edge. Are you always wandering into dangerous territory without a clue? Ella's jaw dropped, a mock gasp escaping her. Excuse me? I'll have you know I am perfectly capable of getting yourself mauled by a rogue wolf, Alaric finished, one brow quirking upward. She narrowed her eyes, pointing a finger at him. Careful, Alaric. You're dangerously close to ruining the whole knight in furry armour thing you've got going. He chuckled again, the sound more relaxed this time, and for a moment the tension that had gripped the forest seemed to dissolve. Ella crossed her arms again, her grin softening into something more curious. So, what's the deal anyway? Do I owe you a favour now? Is there a wolf code about rescuing random humans? Alaric's expression grew thoughtful, his gaze flickering toward the darkened woods as if weighing his answer. Let's just say I was in the right place at the right time, she frowned, not entirely convinced. And this is just normal for you? He smirked, a slow, confident thing that made her stomach flip in a way she absolutely refused to acknowledge. You'd be surprised. Ella rolled her eyes, but the smile lingered on her face. Well, Sir Growls-a-lot, I hope you're ready for some questions, because I've got about 100 of them, starting with, what the heck is going on? Alaric tilted his head, his expression unreadable but faintly amused. Only 100? Oh, don't worry, Ella shot back, her grin widening. That's just the warm-up. For a moment they stood there, the forest humming quietly around them as if holding its breath. It was absurd, surreal, and entirely too much to process. And yet Ella couldn't help but think she'd stumbled into a story she wasn't ready to leave just yet. Alaric's expression shifted as the playful edge melted away, replaced by something heavier. His amber eyes darkened, and the easy smirk that had been teasing at the corners of his mouth vanished. "Ella," he said, his voice low and steady, "you shouldn't be here." Her smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of confusion. "What do you mean? It's just a forest." "It's not just a forest," he said sharply, his gaze flicking to the shadows behind her. "This place, it's dangerous, and not just because of the rogue wolves." She frowned, crossing her arms as if bracing herself against the weight of his words. "Look, I didn't exactly plan for a rogue wolf attack. I was just—" "Wandering into territory you don't understand," he interrupted, his tone firmer now. "This isn't a place for humans, Ella. Not at night, not alone." Her brows shot up at the word humans, but before she could unpack the implications, his gaze locked onto hers. "You need to leave," Alaric continued, his voice softer now but no less serious. "For your own safety." Ella studied him for a long moment, her eyes narrowing as if trying to solve a particularly tricky riddle. "You keep saying that, but you're not exactly giving me a lot of reasons to believe you." His jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he might snap at her, but then his gaze softened, lingering on her face longer than necessary, and she felt her heart skip a beat. "I don't have time to explain," he said finally, his voice quieter but no less insistent. "You just have to trust me." "Trust you?" she echoed, a skeptical eyebrow arching. "You just turned into a wolf in front of me. That's not exactly a great foundation for trust, you know." Alaric's lips twitched, as if her defiance amused him despite himself. "Fair point," he admitted. Ella tilted her head, watching him closely. "So what is it then? Am I trespassing, breaking some ancient wolf rule, or are you just this grumpy with everyone?" For the briefest moment, something like a smile flickered across his face before he masked it with a stern expression. "It's not about rules, it's about survival." His words hung in the air, heavy and deliberate, but the way his gaze lingered on her made Ella wonder if there was more to it than just survival. "Fine," she said, throwing her hands up in mock surrender. "I'll go, but only because you're making it weird." "It's already weird," he muttered under his breath, glancing toward the treetops as if asking the universe for patience. Ella bit back a laugh, turning to pick up her camera from where it had fallen. Dusting it off, she glanced over her shoulder at him. "You know, you're not great at this whole warning thing. You should really work on your delivery." His expression softened for a moment, and he almost looked like he was about to smile again. But then he straightened, his tone firm as he said, "Just get home safe, Ella." She paused, caught off guard by the way her name sounded in his voice, like a secret he wasn't supposed to know. "Sure thing, Sir Growls a lot," she quipped, her grin returning as she started to walk away. "But next time you owe me an explanation, and maybe a shirt." Alaric watched her go, his amber eyes following her retreating figure until she disappeared into the trees. Only then did he let out a quiet sigh, running a hand through his dishevelled hair. "This is going to be trouble," he muttered to himself, but the faint, lingering smile on his face betrayed the fact that he didn't entirely mind. Ella wasn't sure what surprised her more, that she'd just been saved by a man who could turn into a wolf, or that she wasn't sprinting for the hills like a normal person. Instead, she found herself falling into step beside him as he guided her out of the forest, his pace slow and deliberate. "So," she said after a beat of silence, glancing up at him with a crooked smile, "is this where you tell me I'm part of some ancient prophecy or something?" Alaric didn't even break stride, though the corner of his mouth twitched. "No prophecies," he said dryly, "just common sense. You shouldn't be out here alone. Right, because rogue wolves and werewolves are such common threats these days," she shot back, stepping over a gnarled root. "Should I also be worried about vampires and trolls? Maybe a dragon or two?" His lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't miss the way his shoulders stiffened. "Wait," she said, stopping in her tracks. "Don't tell me dragons are real too." "No dragons," he said quickly, his voice a touch too flat to be reassuring. "Oh, my God!" she gasped, grinning as she fell back into step beside him. "You're such a bad liar, you totally hesitated." "I did not," he replied, his tone clipped. "You did, just a little." She gestured with her fingers to emphasize the point. "Now I'm going to have to start carrying fireproof gear on my hikes." "Thanks a lot." Alaric sighed, the sound heavy with resignation. "Do you always talk this much?" "Only when I'm nervous or curious," she said brightly. "And right now, I'm a little bit of both." He glanced at her out of the corner of his eye, the amber gleam in his gaze catching the fading light. "Curiosity can get you killed in a place like this." Ella shrugged, unfazed. "Maybe. Or it could get me answers. Like, how long have you been doing the whole wolf-to-man thing? Is it hereditary? Do you have a tail when you shift?" "Please tell me you have a tail." Alaric stopped abruptly, turning to face her with an expression that fell somewhere between exasperation and amusement. "Unbelievable." "Thank you," she said with a grin, clearly not taking the hint. He shook his head, muttering something under his breath that she couldn't quite catch. When he started walking again, she followed, her camera bag bouncing against her side as she struggled to keep up with his longer strides. "You know," she said, her tone turning softer, "you didn't have to save me back there." His steps faltered for a split second, but he didn't look at her. "I couldn't let you get hurt." Her chest tightened unexpectedly at the quiet sincerity in his voice. She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, suddenly unsure of how to respond. "Well," she said after a moment, trying to keep her tone light, "I guess I owe you one. Maybe next time I can save you from something. A rabid squirrel, maybe." Alaric finally glanced at her, the barest hint of a smirk tugging at his lips. "I'll hold you to that." They walked the rest of the way in a surprisingly comfortable silence, the forest growing less dense as the trail opened up into a clearing. When they reached the edge of the woods, he stopped, his gaze scanning the horizon. "This is as far as I go." Ella turned to face him, her smile softening. "No dramatic farewell? No mysterious warning about staying out of trouble?" His smirk widened slightly. "Stay out of trouble, Ella." She grinned, taking a step backward. "You really need to work on your originality." He watched her for a moment longer, his expression unreadable, before turning and disappearing back into the trees. Ella stood there for a long moment, staring after him. Then she let out a soft laugh, shaking her head as she started down the path. "Werewolves," she muttered under her breath, a bemused smile on her face. "What a day!" Chapter 3. The Alpha's Dilemma. Alaric paced the length of his cabin, the steady rhythm of his boots against the worn wooden floor doing nothing to quiet the storm in his head. The encounter with Ella replayed in his mind, each moment more vivid than the last. Her fearless curiosity, her sharp wit, the way she managed to look entirely unimpressed by a rogue wolf attack, and his mid-battle transformation. She wasn't like anyone he'd ever met. "That's the problem," he muttered under his breath, raking a hand through his already dishevelled hair. "She's exactly the problem." The room was dimly lit, the only light coming from the crackling fireplace that did little to chase away the shadows creeping into his thoughts. He tried to shake it off, tried to focus on the bigger issues at hand, like rogue wolves invading their territory, but his mind kept wandering back to her wide, teasing grin. The way she said his name, like it was both a challenge and a question. He stopped abruptly, gripping the back of a chair as if it might ground him. "Get a grip," he growled to himself. "Talking to yourself now?" Alaric stiffened at the familiar voice, and turned to see his younger brother Gavin leaning casually against the doorframe, his hazel eyes alight with mischief. "What do you want, Gavin?" Alaric asked, his tone clipped. Gavin pushed off the doorframe and strolled into the room, his hands tucked into his jacket pockets. "Oh, nothing much," he said, his grin widening. "Just wanted to check on my dear big brother. You know, the one who's been pacing like a lovesick pup for the past hour." "I'm not pacing," Alaric snapped, though the floorboards told a different story. "Right," Gavin drawled, flopping into the nearest chair. "And I suppose that scowl you've been wearing all day has nothing to do with a certain human?" Alaric's jaw tightened, but he didn't take the bait. "You should be more concerned about the rogue wolves," he said, deflecting. Gavin smirked, clearly unfazed. "Oh, I'm plenty concerned, but let's be honest. They're not the reason you're brooding like some tragic hero in a bad romance novel." "I'm not brooding." "Sure you're not," Gavin said, leaning back with an exaggerated sigh. "You're just thinking intensely about her, with that dreamy, far-away look in your eyes." Alaric shot him a glare sharp enough to cut through steel, but Gavin only chuckled. "Careful, big brother," Gavin said, his grin turning downright wicked. "Your tail's showing." Alaric pinched the bridge of his nose, counting silently to 10. "I don't have time for this." "Of course you don't," Gavin said, sitting up and resting his elbows on his knees. "You're too busy convincing yourself that she's just some random human who wandered into our territory by mistake. Except we both know that's not true, don't we?" Alaric didn't answer, his silence telling enough. Gavin tilted his head, his teasing tone softening just a fraction. "You like her, don't you? She's a human," Alaric said, his voice low. "She doesn't belong in our world." Gavin studied him for a moment, his usual smirk giving way to something more thoughtful. "Maybe she doesn't," he said finally. "But you can't pretend she doesn't matter. Not to you." Alaric didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the flames dancing in the fireplace. Gavin stood, clapping a hand on his shoulder as he passed. "Just think about it," he said, his voice lighter now, "and maybe try not to scare her off next time. You're terrible at first impressions." Alaric shot him a look, but Gavin was already halfway out the door, his laughter echoing behind him. Left alone once more, Alaric let out a heavy sigh and resumed his pacing, the image of Ella's curious, defiant smile etched firmly in his mind. Gavin leaned casually against the doorframe, arms crossed, his smirk ever present. Alaric had stopped pacing, but his shoulders were still tense, his grip on the back of the chair tightening as if it might snap under his fingers. "You know," Gavin said, his voice light but tinged with a warning edge, "Selene isn't exactly the forgiving type. She's not going to take kindly to distractions." Alaric's head snapped up, his amber eyes narrowing. "She's not a distraction?" Gavin raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "Could have fooled me. You've been stomping around this cabin like a wolf with a thorn in his paw ever since you dragged that human out of the woods." "She wasn't dragged," Alaric said through gritted teeth. Gavin pushed off the doorframe, strolling further into the room. "Fine, escorted. Whatever you want to call it. The point is, Celine's not going to care about the details. She's going to see it as you shirking your responsibilities. This has nothing to do with her." Alaric shot back, his voice sharper than he intended. "Oh, but it does," Gavin countered, his smirk fading. "Celine didn't agree to this alliance just for the fun of it. She's got her eye on the bigger picture, and she's counting on you to hold up your end of the bargain." Alaric bristled, the weight of those words settling heavily on his shoulders. He knew Gavin wasn't wrong. Celine wasn't the kind of alpha who overlooked perceived slights, especially ones that might threaten her plans. "I'm not backing out of the alliance," Alaric said firmly. "No," Gavin said, his tone unusually serious now. "But you're walking a fine line, big brother. If Celine gets even the faintest whiff of anything that looks like a distraction—" "She's not a distraction," Alaric interrupted, his voice low and dangerous. "Sure," Gavin said, lifting his hands in mock surrender. "If that's what helps you sleep at night." Alaric glared at him, the tension between them crackling like static electricity, but Gavin's expression softened slightly, and he placed a hand on Alaric's shoulder. "Just be careful," Gavin said, his voice quieter now. "Celine's not someone you want as an enemy, and if you're not careful, you're going to make her one." Alaric didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the flickering flames in the fireplace. Gavin gave his shoulder a light squeeze before stepping back toward the door. "Anyway, I've said my piece. Try not to brood too hard. You'll scare the wolves." With that, Gavin turned and sauntered out of the room, leaving Alaric alone with his thoughts. For a long moment Alaric didn't move. The fire crackled softly, the only sound in the otherwise silent cabin. Gavin's words lingered, unwelcome but undeniable, and Alaric felt the weight of them settle like a stone in his chest. Celine wouldn't take kindly to distractions. Or to Ella. And the worst part, he wasn't entirely sure if he could keep her out of it. The heavy oak doors to Alaric's cabin swung open, with a creak that seemed deliberately ominous. Celine Voss stepped inside, her silver eyes scanning the room with the precision of a predator surveying its prey. She didn't wait for an invitation, she never did. "Still hiding in your cave, Kane?" she said, her tone sharp enough to cut through the thick tension that always seemed to follow her. Alaric, who had been leaning against the stone mantel of the fireplace, didn't bother turning around. He stared into the flickering flames, his brooding silhouette practically etched into the stonework. "Better company here than out there," he replied, his voice low and even, with just a hint of sarcasm. Celine let out a dry laugh, the sound mirthless as she stepped further into the room, her boots clicking against the wooden floor. "Charming as always." Alaric finally turned, his amber eyes meeting her silver ones. The weight of her presence filled the room, and he straightened instinctively, his expression unreadable. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" he asked, folding his arms across his chest. Celine tilted her head, her sleek braid falling over one shoulder as she studied him. "The alliance," she said pointedly. "You've been distant, have I?" he said, his tone feigning innocence. "Yes," she shot back, narrowing her eyes. "You're not exactly subtle, Kane. Do you think I don't notice when you disappear, or when the rogues start encroaching on our borders while you're busy brooding in the woods?" He frowned, his jaw tightening. "The rogues are my problem. I don't need a reminder." Her lips curved into a wry smile. "You're welcome, then. Consider it a free service." They stared at each other for a moment, the tension between them palpable like the charged air before a storm. But then Celine's smirk faltered just a fraction, and she turned away, her gaze drifting to the window, where the forest stretched endlessly beyond. "Do you think I want this?" she asked quietly, her voice losing some of its sharpness. Alaric blinked, caught off guard by the sudden shift in her tone. "What?" "This alliance," she said, still staring out the window. "Do you think I want to tie my pack's fate to yours, to anyone's?" He didn't answer, unsure where she was going with this. Celine let out a sigh, crossing her arms as she leaned against the windowsill. "I didn't claw my way to the top of my pack just to have every decision I make questioned because I'm not him." Alaric tilted his head, his brow furrowing. "Not who?" She turned back to face him, her expression hardening again, but not before he caught the flicker of vulnerability in her eyes. "My father," she said simply. It hit him like a weight. Celine rarely, if ever, spoke about her father, the former alpha of the Nightfang pack, a man whose legacy cast a long shadow over her leadership. "Salim!" "Joe!" she said quickly, cutting him off. Her silver eyes flashed with defiance, though her voice was steadier now. "I don't need your pity, Kane. I just need you to hold up your end of this alliance." Alaric studied her, his usual sharp retorts fading as he saw her for what she was in that moment, not just an alpha, but a leader carrying the weight of expectations she hadn't asked for. "You're doing fine," he said quietly. She scoffed, the sound brittle. "Don't patronize me." "I'm not," he said firmly, stepping closer. "You've got more fight in you than most alphas I've met, Celine. If your father were still around, I think he'd be proud." Her eyes widened just a little before narrowing again as she straightened her posture. "Flattery doesn't suit you, Kane." "It wasn't flattery," he said, his tone matter-of-fact. They stood there in silence, the unspoken weight of their shared burdens filling the space between them. Finally, Celine shook her head and stepped away from the window, her usual sharpness sliding back into place like armor. "Just remember," she said as she moved toward the door, "this alliance isn't just about your pack or mine. It's about survival. Don't let anything or anyone jeopardize that." She didn't wait for a response before walking out, the door swinging shut behind her with a heavy thud. Alaric stood alone, her words lingering in the air like smoke. He stared at the door for a long moment, the weight of her warning settling heavily on his shoulders. "Easier said than done," he muttered, turning back to the fire. The forest was bathed in an otherworldly glow, the kind of silver light that seemed to hum just beneath her skin. Ella wandered through it, her steps light but aimless, the leaves underfoot crunching softly like whispers. She wasn't sure where she was going, only that she was being drawn forward. The air was thick with a strange electric energy, and shadows danced at the edges of her vision, moving in sync with the faint rustling of the trees. Then she saw them, two glowing amber eyes piercing the darkness ahead. They were unblinking, impossibly vivid, and filled with a strange intensity that made her stomach flip. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling but steady enough to echo through the stillness. The eyes didn't blink. As she stepped closer, a chorus of whispers rose around her, low and melodic, like a breeze weaving through ancient trees. "The healer? The bond? Chosen?" Ella spun around, searching for the source of the voices, but the forest was empty save for the glowing eyes that watched her with unsettling focus. "What does that mean?" she demanded, her voice louder now. "What bond? Who's the healer?" The whispers grew louder, overlapping and swirling together in a chaotic harmony. "You must find it, protect it. The bond will save or break." Suddenly the light in the forest dimmed, the glowing eyes vanishing like snuffed-out flames. Darkness rushed in, swallowing everything, and Ella felt herself falling endlessly, her heart pounding in her chest as the whispers reached a crescendo. Ella jolted awake, her breath coming in sharp gasps as her heart thundered in her ears. The familiar walls of her bedroom came into focus, the soft glow of her bedside lamp casting comforting shadows on the pale blue wallpaper. She pressed a hand to her chest, trying to calm her racing heart. That dream! It had felt so real. The whispers still echoed faintly in her mind, their cryptic words swirling together like smoke. As her breathing slowed, she became aware of something else. A faint warm light emanating from her chest. Her gaze dropped, and she froze. The necklace around her neck, a simple silver chain with an opalescent pendant that had belonged to her grandmother, was glowing faintly. "What the—" she whispered, her fingers trembling as they brushed the cool metal of the chain. The pendant pulsed gently, the light fading in and out like a heartbeat. It wasn't bright, just enough to cast a soft glow against her skin, but it sent a chill down her spine nonetheless. She clutched the pendant tightly, as if holding on to it might anchor her in reality. This had to be a trick of the light, or maybe her mind playing games with her after that dream. But deep down she knew better. Her grandmother had always said the necklace was special, though Ella had assumed she meant it in the sentimental sense. "Keep it close, darling," her grandmother had told her more than once. "You'll understand one day." Ella swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the pendant. "Looks like today's the day," she muttered, her voice shaky, but laced with the wry humour that always surfaced when things got too strange to handle. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, her bare feet brushing the cool wooden floor as she stood. The whispers from the dream still lingered in her mind, their cryptic urgency impossible to ignore. The healer. The bond. What did it all mean? And why did she feel like she was about to find out? Chapter 4. Secrets Beneath the Surface. The forest was unnaturally quiet, as though the world itself were holding its breath. Ella's boots crunched against the undergrowth, the sound loud in the stillness. She had no idea why she was out here again, especially after her run-in with the rogue wolf, and the far more intriguing Alaric. Yet something pulled her forward. The pendant around her neck felt warm against her skin, almost as if it were guiding her. "Okay, this is fine," she muttered to herself, her voice barely more than a whisper. Totally normal to wander into the forest after a cryptic dream and a glowing necklace. Nothing weird about this at all. The trees parted abruptly, and Ella stepped into a small glade bathed in soft silvery moonlight. The grass shimmered like frost under the pale glow, and the air was thick with a strange energy that made her skin prickle. In the center of the glade, a figure crouched low, half hidden by shadows. Ella froze, her breath catching in her throat as her eyes adjusted to the dim light. It was a wolf. No, it wasn't quite a wolf. Its shape flickered, shifting in and out of focus like a poorly tuned radio. One moment it had a sleek lupin form, and the next, the broad shoulders of a man. The transformation was mesmerizing and unsettling all at once. Bones cracked and reshaped, fur melted into skin, and claws gave way to human fingers. The creature, or man, let out a low growl that sent a shiver racing down Ella's spine. It wasn't until the transformation slowed that Ella realized exactly who she was looking at. "Alaric?" she whispered, her voice trembling more from shock than fear. His head snapped up, his amber eyes locking onto hers, glowing faintly in the moonlight. For a moment neither of them moved, the weight of the moment pressing down on them like a heavy blanket. "Ella," he said, his voice rough, caught somewhere between a growl and a plea. She stumbled back a step, her hand instinctively clutching the pendant around her neck. "So? You really do that?" Alaric straightened, his bare chest rising and falling with deep, steady breaths. His gaze never left hers, the intensity in his eyes holding her in place even as every instinct screamed at her to run. "I told you it was dangerous out here," he said, his voice low and steady now, though his expression was anything but calm. She huffed out a laugh, though it came out shakier than she'd intended. "You did. What you didn't tell me was that you moonlight as an actual werewolf. Kind of an important detail, don't you think?" He took a cautious step toward her, his movements careful, like he was approaching a skittish animal. "It's not something people usually take well." "Well," she said, forcing her voice to stay light, even as her heart raced, "lucky for you, I'm not most people." Alaric's lips twitched, the faintest hint of a smile flickering across his face, before he caught himself. "You're not afraid?" Ella's grip on her necklace tightened as she lifted her chin. "Not yet. Should I be?" He sighed, running a hand through his dishevelled hair as he muttered something under his breath that sounded suspiciously like, "You're impossible." When he met her gaze again, his expression was unreadable, a strange mix of resignation and admiration. "No," he said quietly, "you shouldn't be." She studied him for a long moment, her thoughts racing. There were 100 questions buzzing in her mind, but none of them made it past her lips. Instead, she took a tentative step forward, her head tilting as she looked him over. "Well," she said with a wry smile, "I've got to admit your dramatic entrances make a lot more sense now." He let out a soft laugh, the sound surprising even him. "You're handling this better than I expected," Ella shrugged, her grin widening. "What can I say? I'm adaptable." But even as she joked, her mind lingered on the raw power she'd seen in his transformation, the way his body had shifted, caught between two worlds. It was both terrifying and fascinating, and she couldn't quite decide which one won out. Alaric watched her carefully, his gaze never wavering. "You should leave, Ella. This place, it's not safe for you." Her smile softened, but she didn't back away. "Neither are you, I think." For a moment they stood there, the glade silent around them. The unspoken weight of what had just happened settled between them like a fragile thread, connecting their worlds in a way that neither of them fully understood, and for the first time, Ella wasn't sure if she wanted to walk away. Ella's lips twitched, her initial shock melting into something softer, warm. She studied Alaric, standing before her with his chest heaving and tension radiating from every inch of him, and then she did what she always did when things got too strange to process. She cracked a joke. "Well," she said, crossing her arms and tilting her head, "that was quite the extreme makeover. Do you always go for the midnight wolf-to-man look, or is this just a special occasion?" Alaric blinked, his brows furrowing as though he hadn't quite heard her correctly. "What?" "You know," she continued, waving a hand in his direction. The whole dramatic transformation thing. It's very cinematic. 10 out of 10 for style points, though the fur transition could use a little work. He stared at her, clearly trying to decide if she was serious. "You're joking," he said flatly. "Of course I'm joking," Ella shot back, throwing her hands up. "What else am I supposed to do? Start screaming? Faint? I feel like that'd be way less helpful." Alaric let out a soft, incredulous laugh, more of a huff, really, and shook his head. "You're unbelievable." "Thank you," she said, beaming as though he'd just paid her the highest compliment. His lips twitched again, and for a moment she thought he might actually smile, but the tension in his shoulders didn't entirely ease, and his gaze remained sharp, scanning her face for any sign of fear. "You're not scared?" he said, finally, as if testing the words out loud. "Should I be?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "That depends," he replied, his tone soft but laced with a hint of warning. "Most people don't exactly take well to what they've just seen." Ella shrugged, her grin never faltering. "Most people don't have to patch up injured wolves, turned men on their back doorstep. Guess I'm just built different." That earned her a real laugh, low, warm, and entirely unexpected. It sent a shiver down her spine, though she told herself it was just the chill of the night air. "You're not what I expected," Alaric admitted, his voice quieter now. Ella's grin softened, and she met his gaze with a curious tilt of her head. "Yeah, well, you're not exactly what I expected either." He opened his mouth to respond, but she cut him off, pointing a finger at him. "Though I have to say," she quipped, "you're kind of setting the bar pretty high for dramatic forest encounters. The next time I run into a werewolf, they're going to have to bring their—" Alaric shook his head, his expression caught between exasperation and amusement. "You're impossible." "And yet here you are," she shot back, her smile widening. For a moment, the weight of the strange otherworldly moment seemed to lift, replaced by the easy, teasing rhythm that Ella seemed to bring with her wherever she went. Alaric found himself relaxing, despite his better judgment, the tension in his chest loosening as her laughter echoed softly through the glade, and for the first time in a long time he wasn't entirely sure if that was a bad thing. Chapter 4. Secrets Beneath the Surface. Alaric sighed, running a hand through his dark hair as he leaned against a tree at the edge of the glade. The sharp angles of his jaw caught the moonlight, but his expression was shadowed, tense. For a long moment he didn't say anything, his amber eyes fixed on a distant point beyond Ella's shoulder. She waited, arms crossed and eyebrow arched, clearly unimpressed with his brooding silence. "You know, for a guy who just pulled off the most intense transformation I've ever seen, you're awfully tight-lipped." He glanced at her, his lips twitching in the faintest hint of a smile before the weight of the moment dragged his features back into seriousness. "This isn't a game, Ella," he said quietly, his voice low and firm. "You shouldn't be here." She tilted her head, unfazed. "You've mentioned that a lot, but you still haven't told me why." He hesitated, his jaw tightening as if physically holding back words. Then, finally, he let out a breath and met her gaze. "There's a lot you don't know," he began, his tone measured. "Things about this forest, about the packs, my pack, the Nightfang pack, that aren't safe. Rogues like the one you saw earlier are just the beginning." "Rogues?" she repeated, testing the word. "Like wolf outlaws?" "Something like that," he said, his expression hardening. "They don't follow the rules of the packs. They're dangerous, unpredictable, and they've been encroaching on our territory more and more lately." She studied him, her gaze sharp despite the warmth in her tone. "And what does that have to do with me?" Alaric pushed off the tree, his broad shoulders tense as he took a step closer to her. "Everything," he said, his voice dropping. "You were in the wrong place at the wrong time. If they had caught you—" "But they didn't," she interrupted, lifting her chin. "Because I stopped them," he shot back, his tone sharper now. "And I can't guarantee I'll always be there to stop them again. You don't belong in this world, Ella. It's not safe for you." For a moment she didn't respond, her expression thoughtful as she processed his words. Then, to his utter disbelief, she shrugged. "Okay," she said simply. Alaric blinked. "Okay?" "Okay," she repeated, her tone light but her eyes steady. "You've got dangerous wolves, rogue packs, territorial disputes. It's a whole supernatural soap opera. Got it? But," she continued, cutting him off, "what you didn't explain is why you're so desperate to scare me off. Because I'm getting the feeling there's more to this than just dangerous woods and stay away for your own good." He froze, his amber eyes narrowing as he studied her. "You're too stubborn for your own good. You know that?" "Yeah," she said with a grin, crossing her arms. "I've heard that once or twice, but you're dodging the question." Alaric let out a low growl of frustration, his hands curling into fists at his sides. "You don't understand what you're getting involved in." "Then explain it to me," she said, her voice softer now but no less determined, "because I'm not going to run off just because you told me to." He stared at her, his expression a mixture of exasperation and something else, something that almost looked like admiration. "This isn't a fight you can win," he said finally, his voice quiet but weighted. Ella tilted her head, her grin softening into a smirk. "Good thing I'm not here to fight, then. I'm here to help." Alaric shook his head, letting out a breathless laugh that held no humour. "You're impossible, and yet," she said, taking a step closer, "here you are, still trying to talk me out of it." The glade fell silent again, the tension between them crackling like static. Alaric opened his mouth as if to argue, but no words came. He wasn't sure whether to admire her resolve or curse it. Ella simply stood there, her arms crossed and her gaze steady, silently daring him to try again. And in that moment, Alaric realized two things. She wasn't going to back down, and whether he liked it or not, she was going to be a part of this world. The tension in the glade lingered, thick as the mist curling around their ankles. Alaric's jaw was set, his amber eyes sharp, but Ella stood her ground, arms crossed and a mischievous spark in her gaze that he was beginning to recognize as her default state. She tilted her head, a playful grin spreading across her face. "So," she began, her tone light and casual, "are you more of a dog person or a cat person?" Alaric blinked, caught completely off guard by the question. "What?" "You know," she said, waving a hand as though the answer were obvious. "If you weren't, part-time wolf, which team would you be on, dogs or cats?" His lips twitched, the barest hint of a smile threatening to break through his serious demeanour. "Dogs, obviously." "Obviously?" Ella echoed, rolling her eyes dramatically. "How original." Alaric raised an eyebrow. "You're surprised." "I don't know," she said with a shrug, her grin widening. "I thought maybe you'd be one of those edgy, misunderstood types who secretly loves cats. Broody wolf guy with a soft spot for kittens. It has a nice ring to it." Alaric let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "Definitely not a cat person." "Why not?" she pressed, her curiosity genuine, despite her teasing tone. "They're unpredictable," he said after a moment, his voice laced with dry humour. "And I don't trust anything that's too small to fight back." Ella snorted, covering her mouth with her hand to stifle the laugh that escaped. "Wow, big scary werewolf scared of a house cat. That's a plot twist." "I'm not scared of them," he corrected, his tone exasperated but amused. "I just don't see the appeal." "Oh, there's the appeal," she said, nodding sagely. "The little toe beans, the dramatic flair. Cats are basically tiny divas who know they run the world." "Exactly," Alaric said, his smirk finally breaking through. "They're too much work. Dogs are loyal, cats demand a 5-star lifestyle and still act like they're doing you a favour by existing." Ella laughed, the sound bright and unguarded, and Alaric felt a strange warmth settle in his chest. "Well," she said, her grin softening, "you can't exactly talk. You're not exactly low-maintenance yourself." His eyebrows lifted. "Is that so?" "Oh, absolutely," she said, nodding with mock seriousness. "The brooding, the mysterious warnings, the whole 'I'm too dangerous to be around' vibe. You're a walking soap opera, Alaric. And I'm pretty sure you're high maintenance." For a moment he was silent, staring at her with an intensity that made her grin falter ever so slightly. Then he leaned in. just enough to close the distance between them. "I'm not high maintenance," he said, his voice low and smooth. "I'm just complicated." Ella swallowed, her breath catching at the shift in his tone. But before she could respond, the playful glint returned to his eyes, and he straightened, stepping back. "Still not a cat person, though," he added, his smirk firmly back in place. Ella exhaled, shaking her head as her grin returned. "Good to know," she said lightly. Though her heart was still racing, the tension between them had eased, replaced by a strange, playful energy that felt almost comfortable, like they were old friends instead of two people who had stumbled into each other's lives by sheer chance. And for a brief moment, standing in the glow of the moonlit glade, the rest of the world faded away. The glade fell into an easy silence, the kind that felt heavier with things left unsaid. The silver light of the moon bathed the clearing, softening the edges of the world and painting the moment in shades of something close to magical. Ella shifted her weight, glancing down at her boots before looking back up at Alaric. He stood a few steps away, his posture relaxed, but his gaze was fixed on her with an intensity that made her heart skip a beat. "Well," she said, breaking the silence with a forced casualness, "this has been enlightening. I'll definitely think twice before wandering off into the woods next time." He tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable but somehow softer than before. "That would be wise." Her lips twitched into a small smile. "You know, you could just say, 'I'm glad you're okay,' like a normal person. It wouldn't kill you." Alaric's mouth curved in a faint smirk, but he didn't take the bait. Instead, he stepped closer, his gaze searching hers for a long, quiet moment. "You should go," he said finally, his voice low and steady. Ella frowned, her resolve flickering for just a second before she nodded. "Right. I'll just head back to my normal, non-werewolf-infested life." She turned, taking a step toward the edge of the glade, but something stopped her, a strange pull, like an invisible thread tying her to the spot. She hesitated, glancing back over her shoulder. "Alaric," she said softly, her tone stripped of its usual humor. He met her gaze, his expression as guarded as ever. "Thanks," she said, her lips curling into a small, genuine smile. "For saving me. Twice now." Something shifted in his eyes, a flicker of warmth breaking through the amber intensity. He nodded once, a subtle movement that carried more weight than words. Without another word, Ella turned and started down the faint path leading out of the glade. Each step felt heavier than it should have, the forest pressing in around her as the distance between them grew. Alaric watched her go, his arms crossed and his jaw tight. He told himself it was for the best, that keeping her at arm's length was the only way to keep her safe. But as her figure disappeared into the shadows, he couldn't shake the feeling that something invisible had shifted between them. A thread, thin but unbreakable, tied their paths together in a way he didn't fully understand. Ella's pendant glowed faintly against her chest as she walked, the warmth of it mirroring the strange flutter in her heart. She couldn't explain it, couldn't put it into words, but she felt it, the quiet, undeniable connection that had sparked in that moonlit glade. Neither of them said it aloud, but the bond between them was there, unspoken but impossible to ignore, and as Alaric turned back to the shadows of the forest, he realized with a heavy certainty that their lives would never be the same. Chapter 5. The Hidden Truth. The morning air carried the scent of rain, fresh, earthy, and lingering like a whisper of a storm long past. Inside the clinic, the sharp tang of antiseptic mingled with the warm musk of fur, the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock providing a steady counterpoint to the rustle of papers on my desk. I pressed my fingertips against the open pages of my grandmother's journal, feeling the ghost of her presence in the delicate looping script. Elizabeth Harper, midwife, herbalist, and healer, and possibly something more. The clinic had been quiet today, giving me the rare luxury of time to comb through the old leather-bound journals I'd dug out of my grandmother's trunk. They smelt of dust and old lavender, their brittle pages filled with remedies, birth records, and cryptic notes that hinted at something beyond mere medicine. I frowned, brushing a stray auburn curl from my face as I traced a faded passage with my fingertip. A healer's gift is not in the hands, but in the soul, bound by blood, tempered by the moon. I exhaled, leaning back in my chair. Moon. That word had been appearing a lot in her writings. More than coincidence. A soft chuff at my feet made me glance down. Sir Flopsalot, the clinic's latest stray-turned resident, lifted his shaggy head and gave me a look that might as well have been a question. I scratched behind his lopsided ear absent-mindedly. "You're no help, buddy," I murmured. The pendant around my neck pulsed faintly. Just a flicker of warmth like a heartbeat against my skin. I lifted it, turning the opalescent stone between my fingers. It had been in my family for generations, passed from mother to daughter. Last night it had glowed. I wasn't the kind of person who got rattled easily, but that was a hell of a thing to wake up to. My dreams had been strange, full of disembodied whispers and shadowy figures at the edge of firelight. They spoke in fragments, murmuring of bonds, of dangers, of something coming. And then there was Alaric. My gut twisted at the thought of him, his amber eyes watching me with that unsettling intensity, his words carrying the weight of warnings he wouldn't fully explain. He'd told me to stay out of this, to stay safe. I had a feeling I wasn't going to listen. A sudden gust rattled the clinic's windows, the overcast sky outside darkening as if the world itself was shifting. I closed the journal and slid it into my bag. I needed more than old ink and half-remembered dreams. I needed answers. The road to Miss Halloway's cabin was the kind of winding path that made GPS signals flicker and disappear. Gravel crunched under my tires as I eased my truck to a stop, taking in the place with a healthy dose of skepticism. The cabin was old, its wooden beams blackened by time and soot, its slanted roof barely holding back the wild embrace of the forest. Thick vines curled around the porch railing, and from the eaves, bundles of dried herbs and animal bones swayed like wind chimes. A weathered wooden sign nailed to the door read simply, "Seek truth at your own risk. Promising." I grabbed my bag, pushed open the truck door, and made my way up the steps, each creak under my boots a protest. Before I could knock, the door swung open. A woman stood there, barefoot and unmoved by the chill in the air. Miss Halloway was ancient in a way that had nothing to do with age. Her silver-streaked raven hair cascaded over her shoulders, and her dark eyes, deep as the roots of the trees around us, studied me like she was reading the marrow of my bones. She exhaled through her nose, stepping aside. "Took you long enough." Well, that wasn't ominous. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of burning sage and something spiced. Cardamom, maybe? The cabin was cluttered but intentional, every trinket, every worn book placed with purpose. In the centre of the room, a small iron cauldron simmered over a low flame, the liquid inside bubbling in lazy golden circles. Miss Halloway lowered herself into a wooden chair with the ease of someone who had long stopped fearing the weight of the world. "You came for answers." I pulled my pendant from beneath my shirt. "I think I'm owed a few." Her gaze flickered to the stone. Something in her expression shifted. Less amusement, more gravity. "Your blood calls to the old ways." The words sent a shiver up my spine. "What does that mean?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she leaned forward, holding out her hands. I hesitated before placing mine in hers. Her palms were warm, rough with age, and something older still. The moment her fingers closed over mine, a whispering wind stirred through the cabin, though no windows were open. The fire flickered, the scent of damp earth and cedar filled my lungs, and then I saw, a flash of moonlit trees, a woman with my grandmother's eyes kneeling before a wolf with fur like silvered mist. The wolf pressed its forehead to hers, and in that moment something passed between them. Something ancient, something binding. Then the scene shifted. A burning field, blood on the ground, a woman standing alone, her hand raised, the air around her shimmering with power. She was me, and yet she wasn't. I gasped, ripping my hands free. The cabin snapped back into focus, the fire steady once more, the whispers gone. Miss Holloway sat back, exhaling. "You are the bloodline's last." My heart pounded. "Last what?" She folded her hands. "The last healer. The bond between your kind and theirs." I stared at her, the weight of those words pressing against my ribs. "You mean the wolves?" She nodded. "Your gift is tied to theirs. Your presence in their world is no accident." I clenched my fists, fighting the rising tide of disbelief. "That's insane. I'm just a vet, a regular person." "Were you, when you healed that wolf at your door? Did you notice how quickly he recovered? Did you question why the rogue wolves hunted you in the forest?" I swallowed hard. "You are part of this story, child, whether you choose to accept it or not." I shook my head. "I don't even know what I'm supposed to do." Miss Holloway's dark eyes bored into mine. "You will. The path is already moving beneath your feet, and soon they will come for you." A chill crawled down my spine. "Who's they?" She didn't answer. I didn't ask again. When I finally stepped outside, the air was colder, sharper. The sky had darkened further, the scent of rain more pronounced. I tightened my grip on the pendant. I had come here looking for answers. I wasn't sure I liked what I'd found. I thought of Ulrich's warning, of Celine's sharp, knowing gaze, of the rogue wolves that had lunged at me with intent, the healer, the bond, the prophecy. My fate wasn't just mine anymore. I exhaled. It never had been. The forest was uneasy. It wasn't just the usual stillness of night or the weight of unseen eyes pressing against the darkness. Something else lurked at the edges of the world. Something hungry, something wrong. Ulrich crouched low to the ground, his fingers pressing against damp earth as he inhaled deeply. The night air carried the usual scents. Pine, damp leaves, distant water. But underneath it all, the stench of rot clung like an infection. The rogues had been here. He rose fluidly, rolling the tension from his shoulders as Celine emerged from the trees, her silver eyes gleaming like polished steel. The moonlight made her look almost ethereal, her sleek black braid shifting as she moved. "You feel it?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. Alaric nodded. "They're getting bolder." Celine's lips pressed into a tight line. Or desperate. A distant howl cut through the silence, long and mournful, but there was something in the cadence that made Alaric stiffen. This wasn't a challenge, it was a message. "We're not dealing with ordinary rogues anymore," he muttered. "This isn't random aggression, it's coordinated." Celine exhaled sharply, crossing her arms. "That's not possible. Rogues don't have structure. That's why they're rogues." Alaric looked at her. "Then explain that." A second howl answered the first, this one closer, too close. Celine's eyes flicked to the tree line. "We need to move." The council hall was alive with tension. The ancient wooden table bore the scars of 1,000 old grievances, and tonight would add more. Alaric sat at one end, his fingers drumming an impatient rhythm on the tabletop. Across from him, Celine leaned forward, her expression carved from stone. 3 attacks in 5 days, she said. "That's not a coincidence." "No," Alaric agreed. "And if they're following a pattern, we need to find the center of it before they make their next move." A murmur rippled through the gathered wolves. Gavin, leaning lazily against the far wall, let out a low whistle. "And here I thought we were past the days of rogue politics. Guess they missed the memo." Alaric shot him a look. "Not the time." Gavin held up his hands, just saying. Celine ignored him, tapping her fingers against the map spread before them. "They're moving along the western border. If we don't push back now, they'll settle. And once that happens—" "They'll take more," Alaric finished grimly. A low growl echoed from the other side of the room. One of Celine's wolves, a broad-shouldered enforcer named Cade, leaned forward, his thick fingers curled into fists. "Then why aren't we hunting them down now?" Celine's gaze flicked to Alaric, silent agreement in her eyes. "Because we don't know what we're dealing with." The thought gnawed at him. The rogues weren't just fighting like animals. They were thinking, planning, and worse, some of them had moved in ways that weren't natural, too fast, too strong, their eyes glowing with something more than moonlight. Something was wrong, and if they didn't figure out what, they wouldn't have a pack left to defend. The night was thick with shadows. Alaric moved soundlessly through the underbrush, Celine at his side, their wolves fanning out along the ridgeline. The air hummed with tension, every rustling leaf a potential threat, every shift in the wind a whispered warning. It was almost easy to forget the constant hum of unease, until a familiar scent hit him. Alaric stopped so suddenly that Celine nearly walked into him. "What?" she whispered. He turned his head, inhaling again. Wild mint, fresh hay, a trace of lavender. His stomach sank. "Ella?" Celine's expression darkened. "Damn it!" A twig snapped, and then she was there, a stubborn, ridiculous human standing in the middle of a werewolf patrol as if she belonged there. "Hi," Ellis said, voice too casual for the situation. Alaric exhaled through his nose, resisting the urge to throttle her. "What are you doing here?" Ellie lifted her chin, eyes flashing. "I was looking for answers." "This isn't a game, Harper. You don't get to wander into our territory like some reckless—" "You're right," Ella cut in, stepping forward. "It's not a game. But you're missing something. I can feel it." Alaric's grip tightened at his sides. "Feel what?" She hesitated, then pressed a hand to her chest, where that damn pendant of hers rested against her skin. "Something's wrong. I don't know how I know, I just do." Celine let out a low growl, but Alaric was watching Ella's face, the way her pulse fluttered in her throat, the way her hands clenched like she was bracing for something she couldn't explain. And then the wind shifted. A howl shattered the quiet, low, sharp rung. Alaric moved before he could think, grabbing Ella and pulling her against him, just as the first rogue lunged from the trees. A blur of fur, a flash of teeth, chaos. The fight was brutal, fast. Alaric hit the ground, rolling, twisting to get between the rogue and Ella. Celine was already moving, her claws raking against the rogue's flank as it snarled and snapped. But then it did something no rogue should be able to do. It vanished. 1 second it was there, snarling, its glowing eyes locked onto Ella. The next it flickered like a candle flame and was gone. Silence! Ella's breath came fast and sharp against Alaric's shoulder. Celine swore. "Did you see that?" Alaric nodded, his heart still pounding. "It wasn't just fast, it was—" "Teleporting," Ella finished, voice raw. No one spoke. Then from the darkness a whisper. "Too human to be a wolf? You cannot stop what has already begun." The air went still, and Alaric knew this was just the beginning. Chapter 6. Blood and Fire. The call came just before dawn. Alaric had barely closed his eyes when Gavin kicked the door open, breathless and grim. "We've got trouble," he said, tossing Alaric's jacket at him. In the world they lived in, trouble wasn't a possibility, it was an inevitability. Alaric was already moving, shrugging on his coat as he stalked past his brother and into the cold morning air. The scent of pine and damp earth filled his lungs, but beneath it was something sharper, something wrong. Blah! The wind carried it from the western border, along with the acrid stench of burned wood. Not a skirmish, a slaughter. The remote outpost sat nestled in the valley, a fortified cavern surrounded by dense trees and stone ridges. Smoke curled in the early dawn light, thick and heavy, the scent clogging the back of Alaric's throat. Bodies littered the clearing, some breathing, some not. Wolves lay tangled together in heaps, their fur matted with blood, their sides rising and falling in ragged gasps. Celine stood in the middle of it all, her silver eyes like cut glass. She wasn't wearing her usual mask of cool confidence. Her braid was half undone, her black leathers torn, but she was still standing, barely. Alaric caught the faint tremor in her hands before she curled them into fists. She turned as he approached, voice taut. "You're late." "I didn't get an invitation." His gaze swept the wreckage. "Looks like a hell of a party." Celine didn't bother with a retort. "We lost 2. Another 3 won't make it through the night." His jaw clenched. "And the rogues?" Her eyes flicked toward the tree line where the bodies of several wolves, but not enough, lay sprawled in the undergrowth. Their fur was charred in places, burned from the inside out. Ella's scent hit him before he saw her. Alaric turned, finding her crouched beside a wounded pack member, her hands slick with blood. She looked up, her green eyes flashing. "Before you yell at me for showing up, let's be clear. I'm saving your people." Damn her for making sense. Ella pressed a hand against a gaping wound on a young wolf's flank. Blood pooled around her fingers, but beneath them a faint glow pulsed. The same unnatural opalescent light that flickered in her pendant. Alaric exhaled sharply. "Not human. Not anymore." Celine saw it too. The other alpha's expression flickered, something sharp and knowing passing through her gaze before she turned away. "Get them stable. We'll talk later." The weight in her voice sent a shiver down Alaric's spine. Night fell over the outpost. The worst of the wounded had been carried inside, the dead laid in careful rows beneath the trees. The survivors moved with the quiet efficiency of those too tired to grieve yet. Alaric sat near the dying fire, his arms braced on his knees, watching the flames. Selene broke the silence first. "They weren't normal rogues." He didn't look at her. "I noticed." "They didn't fight like loners," she continued. "They moved together, and that fire." She shook her head. "We don't know what we're dealing with." Alaric did, or at least he had a damn good idea. "Ella?" He turned his head slightly, catching sight of her where she sat a few feet away, staring into the fire with something lost in her expression. "You knew," he said to Celine, keeping his voice low. "Back at the border, when she touched her pendant, you knew what she was?" Celine didn't flinch. "I suspected," she admitted, watching the fire. "The seer's prophecy. It wasn't just about the wolves, it was about her." Eva looked up at that, eyes narrowing. "So I'm the center of a prophecy I didn't ask for. Great. Anything else you'd like to drop on me?" Celine's jaw tightened. She was quiet for a long moment before she finally spoke. "My father believed in bloodlines," she said. "He believed that power passed through generations and that some gifts should never mix." Alaric frowned. "What are you saying?" Celine exhaled, her fingers curling into the fabric of her sleeve. "I'm saying I have a sister I never met, a half-sister." Silence. Ella's brows drew together. "And?" Celine's voice was razor-thin. "And she was like you." The words sat between them, heavy and unspoken. Alaric understood now why Celine had looked at Ella the way she did, not with suspicion, but with recognition. "She died," Celine continued, her expression unreadable, "before I ever met her. Before she had a chance." The fire crackled. Alaric watched the way Celine's fingers tightened around the hilt of her dagger, her only tell. "Your father?" he asked. Celine's gaze snapped to him, sharp as a knife. Alaric had his answer. The air outside was crisp, the moon casting silver light over the ruined clearing. Ella followed Alaric into the cold, her pendant still faintly glowing against her collarbone. "You're not okay," he said finally. She let out a breath that wasn't quite a laugh. "How could you tell?" Alaric turned toward her, taking in the tension in her shoulders, the way her arms wrapped around herself like a shield. "Not fear, just exhaustion." He hesitated, then reached for the pendant. He didn't touch it, just let his fingers hover above the faintly pulsing stone. "It's reacting to you," he murmured. "To them." Ella shivered. "I know." She looked up at him then, her green eyes searching his. "I don't know what I am, Alaric." "You're Ella," he said simply. She laughed, short and disbelieving. "That's not enough, is it?" He didn't have an answer for that. From inside the cabin, Celine's voice carried through the night. "We leave at first light. The rogues aren't done, and neither are we." Ella sighed. "So much for a quiet life." Alaric let the ghost of a smirk cross his lips. "You were never meant for quiet." She met his gaze, something unspoken passing between them. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of rain. The wolves would hunt again soon, and for better or worse, Ella Harper was part of the pack now. The storm came as a whisper first, the scent of rain thick in the air, the trees bending under the weight of a wind that hadn't yet arrived. Alaric stood at the ridge overlooking the valley, his sharp eyes scanning the dark horizon. They were coming. Behind him, the warriors of the Nightfang Pack and Moonshadow Pack stood ready, their tense energy crackling like the lightning that licked the sky in the distance. The uneasy alliance between the two packs had held, for now, but tonight would test more than just their ability to fight. It would test who survived. The first low growl came from the tree line. Alaric's hands curled into fists. "They're close," Celine said at his side, her silver eyes glinting like sharpened steel. Alaric nodded once, already shifting his weight in preparation. No more waiting. From the far side of the clearing, Ella moved through the ranks of the wounded, her pendant pulsing faintly against her collarbone. She shouldn't be here, but she wasn't leaving. He caught her eyes across the battlefield, and something passed between them, a silent understanding. Then the rogues came. They rushed from the trees like a living shadow, their eyes glowing with a sickly, unnatural light. Alaric barely had time to shift before the first wave hit, bodies slamming into each other, claws raking through flesh, teeth snapping against bone. Thunder cracked overhead, and then the world was chaos. Alaric tore through the first rogue, his fangs sinking deep into its throat before he tossed it aside. Another came, then another. Beside him, Celine was a blur of black fur and lethal precision, every movement calculated, her claws slicing through the enemy like she was born for this. The rogues weren't fighting like wolves anymore. They moved with an unnatural speed, their bodies flickering in and out of focus like smoke caught between worlds. Alaric lunged for one, only for it to vanish mid-leap and reappear behind him. Damage, magic! A sharp yelp came from somewhere in the melee. Alaric turned. Too late. A rogue wolf with burning red eyes had broken through the line, its fangs bared, and it was going straight for Ella. He moved, but she was faster. The moment the rogue wolf lunged, Ella's pendant ignited. Not a glow, not a flicker, a full, blinding, white-hot eruption of light. The rogue never reached her. It howled in agony, the force of the energy slamming it backward as if an invisible hand had thrown it across the battlefield. Alaric skidded to a halt, breathing hard, eyes locked on Ella. She stood in the center of the clearing, her eyes wide, her skin glowing faintly, the pendant burning with power. The battle paused. For one breathless moment both sides watched as Ella stumbled forward, pressing a shaking hand against her chest. The air around her shimmered, a rippling force spreading outward. The wolves nearest her, Alaric, Celine, even the wounded warriors, felt it. A pulse. A bond. Alaric's own wolf recognized it immediately. This wasn't just magic, this was pack. The rogues howled in fury and surged forward again, but now the packs were no longer just fighting, they were connected. Ella's power rushed through them like wildfire, threading between warriors, bolstering strength, knitting wounds even as they fought. Celine was the first to test it. She lunged for a rogue, her claws digging into its side, and instead of fading into shadow, it solidified beneath her grip. They weren't flickering away anymore. Alaric wasted no time. He leapt, his powerful form colliding with the next rogue, tearing into flesh that no longer disappeared on contact. They could be killed now. And so they were. The battlefield erupted into a new kind of war, one where the packs fought as a single force, moving in perfect unnatural synchronicity. The rogues who had relied on their strange magic, their ability to shift and flicker through reality, were now trapped. One by one they fell. The final rogue stood at the edge of the battlefield, its red eyes gleaming, something almost human lurking beneath the rage. Alaric shifted back, breathing hard. He met Celine's gaze across the clearing. They both felt it. This thing, whatever it was, wasn't fully wolf anymore. Ella took a step forward, her pendant still pulsing. The rogue's eyes flicked to her, then to the destruction around them. It let out a low, shuddering growl, not a sound of defeat, but a warning. This isn't over. Then it vanished, not flickered, nor shifted. Gone. A deep, bone-weary silence settled over the battlefield. The rain came a moment later, washing blood into the earth. The survivors gathered by the fire that night, their bodies bruised, their wounds half-healed by Ella's inexplicable magic. Alaric sat beside her, watching the way the light flickered against her face, still too pale, her hands still trembling from the power she had wielded. He reached out, not thinking, not stopping himself. His fingers brushed against hers, and she didn't pull away. "That was something," she murmured. Understatement. He let out a slow breath. "You bound us, Ella." She turned to him, her green eyes searching his. "What does that mean?" "It means," Celine said from across the fire, "you're one of us now." Ella swallowed, her hand tightening around her pendant. For the first time since all of this started, she didn't argue. She simply nodded. Outside, the wind howled again. And somewhere, in the darkness, the true enemy waited. The world was quiet in the way only a battlefield could be, after the fighting had ended. Alaric stood at the edge of the valley, looking down at the remnants of the war they had won. The sky was bruised with the last traces of night, but already dawn crept along the horizon, painting the world in shades of gold and soft pink. A new day, rising from the wreckage of the old. The ground beneath his boots was damp, blood-soaked, but the scent of rain had washed away most of the carnage. The battle had been won. The rose scattered, but the dead still lay where they had fallen. Behind him, the survivors moved through the wreckage, silent figures tending to the wounded, pulling the fallen from the field with hands that trembled but did not stop. Victory never came without a price. Celine was the first to approach. She was not unscathed. A fresh gash ran along her temple, the dried blood making her look almost feral in the early light, but her silver eyes were clear. Watchful, she had survived worse. She came to stand beside him, staring down at what was left of the battlefield. "We won," Alaric said finally. Celine exhaled through her nose. "Did we?" Alaric knew what she meant. The enemy had fled, not fallen. That last rogue, the one with the red eyes, the one that vanished rather than die, was still out there, watching, waiting. This wasn't the end, but it was an end. For now that had to be enough. Celine crossed her arms. "Your people fought well." Alaric glanced at her, caught the reluctant respect in her expression. "So did yours." For a moment neither of them spoke. Once they had been enemies. Two alphas at war with more than just bloodlines. But the battle had forged something else between them. Not friendship. Not yet. But something close. Celine shifted on her feet, her mouth pressing into something almost like a smirk. "Try not to let it go to your head, Cain," Alaric snorted. "Likewise, Voss." They stood there a little longer, not as adversaries, but as leaders bound by something bigger than their differences. Ella stood a few paces away from the fire, her arms wrapped around herself, staring at the horizon. She looked different, not in a way anyone else would notice. But Alaric did. She carried herself with a new kind of stillness, a quiet certainty that hadn't been there before. The power that had erupted from her during the battle had not left her. It lingered in her bones, in the way the pendant at her throat still pulsed, in the way the wind seemed to bend around her like it too knew she was something more now. She had changed. And she was finally starting to accept it. Alaric approached, his footsteps crunching softly against the damp earth. "You should be resting." Ella huffed a quiet laugh, still watching the sky. "So should you." Fair point. She turned her head slightly, just enough to meet his gaze. "They keep looking at me differently." Alaric knew who she meant, the pack, the wolves she had saved. "They are grateful," he said simply. She swallowed, turning fully toward him now. "They expect something from me?" He tilted his head, studying her. "What do you think that is?" Ella hesitated. Then slowly she lifted a hand to touch the pendant at her chest. It still glowed softly, steady and warm. "I think," she murmured, "they are waiting to see if I'm strong enough to be what they need me to be." Alaric held her gaze. The truth was, she already was. But this was something she had to believe on her own. He exhaled, stepping closer. Not touching, but close enough that she could feel the steady, grounded weight of him beside her. "You saved them, Ella," he said quietly. "No matter what happens next, that's real." She blinked, then offered him the smallest, softest smile. Alaric felt something tighten in his chest. Then, in the distance, the sun finally broke free from the horizon. A new day, a new world. And for the first time in a long time, Alaric Kane believed in something more than survival. He believed in what came next. As the pack gathered, as wounds were tended and bodies were laid to rest, the bond between them all remained, forged in battle, strengthened by fire, and at its centre, Ella stood. No longer an outsider, but something more. Alaric, Celine, and Ella shared a final look before turning toward the future, toward whatever fight lay ahead, and as they did, Ella's pendant pulsed one last time, steady, unshaken, and eternal.